The mountains of Albania had witnessed conquerors before. Romans, Byzantines, Bulgarians, all had marched through these valleys, and all had eventually retreated, broken by the stubborn silence of stone and the fiercer silence of its people. But in the spring of 1423, a different kind of army descended upon the fortress of Kruja, and this time, the mountains themselves seemed to tremble. Gion Castrioti stood on the ramparts of his ancestral stronghold, watching the Ottoman banners multiply across the valley below like locusts darkening a wheat field. He was a proud man, lord of a domain that stretched from the Adriatic coast to the peaks of the accursed mountains. His family had ruled these lands for generations, had baptized their children in the same stone church where his father and grandfather had been baptized. Now, Sultan Murad II demanded what no Castrioti had ever surrendered. Not gold, not land, but blood. The practice was called devshirme, the blood tax. Christian families throughout the Balkans were forced to surrender their sons to the Ottoman state. These boys would be converted to Islam, trained as soldiers or administrators, and transformed into instruments of the very empire that had stolen them. It was elegant in its cruelty, forcing conquered peoples to fuel their own subjugation. Before we begin this journey into one of history's most extraordinary tales of resistance and redemption, I need to ask you something. Where are you watching from? Drop your location in the comments. And if this is your first time on our channel, subscribe now, because what you're about to hear is a story that empires tried to erase, but courage refused to let die. Gion had resisted the Sultan's demands for years, playing the dangerous game of Balkan politics, switching allegiances between Ottoman and Venetian powers, buying time with promises he never intended to keep. But time, like all currencies, eventually runs out. The Ottoman army before him numbered 20,000. His garrison held perhaps 2,000 men. The mathematics of survival left no room for pride. His wife, Voisava, found him still standing at the rampart as the sun began to set, painting the enemy camp in shades of blood and gold. She was a Serbian princess, daughter of a noble house that had already learned the cost of Ottoman resistance at the field of Kosovo. She knew what her husband was contemplating before he spoke. "How many?" she asked, her voice steady despite the tears that would not fall. "4. The word came out hollow. "He demands 4 of our sons." They had 5 boys. Reposh, the eldest at 17, Stanisha, 15, Constantine, 13, and the youngest of the 4 demanded Gerg, barely 9 years old, with his mother's dark eyes and his father's stubborn jaw. Only the infant, whom they had hidden in the mountains with trusted relatives, would remain. "Perhaps," Voisava whispered, "perhaps they will remember who they are." Gion turned to face her, and in his eyes she saw something worse than grief. She saw the death of hope. "No one remembers," he said. "That is the genius of it. They take boys and return men who have forgotten they were ever anything but Ottoman." The surrender ceremony took place 3 days later in the valley below the fortress. Gion Castrioti knelt before the Sultan's representative, a pasha whose name history has not bothered to preserve, and pledged his loyalty to the Ottoman throne. In exchange, his lands would remain nominally his people would be spared the worst depredations of conquest, and his sons would receive the finest education the empire could offer. The 4 boys stood in a line, dressed in their finest Albanian garments, white shirts embroidered with red thread, the ancient patterns their mother had sewn by candlelight. Reposh stood rigid, his fists clenched at his sides. Stanisha wept openly, making no effort to hide his tears. Constantine stared at the ground, already retreating into some interior fortress where the world could not reach him. But Gerg, the youngest, the smallest, the one the Ottoman officers barely glanced at, watched everything with those dark, unreadable eyes. The journey to Adrianople took 6 weeks, and in that time, Gerg Castrioti learned his first lesson in survival. Memory is a wound that must be cauterized. The Ottoman handlers were not cruel exactly. Cruelty would damage valuable property, but they were thorough. The boys were forbidden to speak Albanian. They were forbidden to pray in the Christian manner. They were forbidden to speak of home, of family, of anything that existed before the moment they entered Ottoman service. Gerg's brothers broke in different ways. Reposh, the eldest, attempted escape twice and was beaten so severely the second time that he walked with a limp for the rest of his short life. Stanisha found refuge in absolute submission, becoming more Ottoman than his captors within months. Constantine simply stopped speaking altogether, retreating so far into himself that he eventually vanished into the anonymity of some provincial garrison, never to be heard from again. But George adapted. At 9 years old, he understood instinctively what his older brothers could not grasp, that resistance must be invisible to survive, that the strongest fortresses are those the enemy cannot see. He learned Turkish with frightening speed. He memorized the Quran with such precision that his teachers marked him for advancement. He excelled at every physical test, every martial exercise, every competition the Devshirme system placed before him. The palace school at Adrianople was designed to transform Christian boys into the empire's most loyal servants. For most, it succeeded completely. They emerged as janissaries, elite infantry who formed the backbone of Ottoman military power, or as administrators who governed provinces larger than their birth countries. They married Muslim women, raised Muslim children, and died believing they had always been exactly what the empire made them. George became Iskander, the Turkish form of Alexander, and his teachers added Bey to mark his noble origins. Skanderbeg. The name would one day make sultans tremble, but in those early years it was simply a label, a new identity meant to replace everything he had been. He was not the largest of the young janissaries, nor the strongest in raw terms, but he possessed something his instructors had rarely encountered, an ability to see the whole battlefield while others saw only the enemy before them. In training exercises, he consistently outmaneuvered opponents with superior numbers. In strategic games, he anticipated moves his teachers hadn't considered. By 14, he was leading training squadrons. By 18, he commanded a unit of cavalry in actual combat. The Ottoman military machine was the most sophisticated in the world, and Skanderbeg absorbed its secrets like a sponge drawing water. He learned the logistics of moving armies across vast distances, the psychology of siege warfare, the delicate art of managing soldiers from dozens of conquered peoples. He learned when to attack and when to feign retreat, when to show mercy and when mercy was weakness. He became, in short, exactly what the Devshirme system intended, a perfectly forged weapon of Ottoman power. His first major campaign came in 1438, when Sultan Murad II sent an army to crush a rebellion in Anatolia. Skanderbeg, now 24 years old, commanded a cavalry regiment of 500 men. The rebel forces held a mountain pass that 3 previous assaults had failed to take, leaving the main Ottoman army trapped in a valley with dwindling supplies. The commanding pasha, frustrated and embarrassed, called his officers to council. Most advised patience, wait for the rebels' supplies to run out, starve them into submission. Others suggested a massive frontal assault, accepting heavy casualties for a quick resolution. Skanderbeg remained silent until the pasha demanded his opinion. "The pass is impregnable from the front," Skanderbeg said, tracing lines on the map with his finger. "But here, and here, the mountains are not as steep as they appear. A small force, perhaps 200 men, could climb through the night and strike the rebel camp from behind at dawn. The confusion would last only minutes, but in those minutes, our main force could take the pass." The pasha laughed. "You would send 200 men against a force of thousands? They would be slaughtered. Not if they strike the supply wagons and ammunition stores rather than the soldiers themselves. An army that sees its food burning behind it does not fight. It runs." The plan worked exactly as Skanderbeg had predicted. His climbing force set fire to the rebel supplies just as dawn broke, and in the resulting chaos the Ottoman army swept through the pass with minimal casualties. The pasha received a commendation from the Sultan. Skanderbeg received something more valuable, a reputation. Word of the young commander's brilliance reached Sultan Murad II himself, and in 1440, Skanderbeg was summoned to the imperial court at Adrianople. The Sultan was a complex man, a conqueror who wrote poetry, a warrior who longed for peace, a ruler who understood that empires are built not only with swords, but with the loyalty of exceptional men. He found such a man in Skanderbeg. Over the following 3 years, the Albanian became one of the Sultan's most trusted military commanders. He was granted estates, given command of increasingly important campaigns, admitted to councils where the empire's most sensitive strategies were discussed. He dined with the Sultan, rode beside him in processions, received gifts of horses and weapons and slaves. To all appearances, the Devshirme system had achieved its perfect triumph. The son of a Christian rebel had become a pillar of Ottoman power, but appearances, as the mountains of Albania knew, could be deceiving. Skanderbeg never spoke of home, never asked about his family, never gave any indication that he remembered a time before he was Ottoman. Yet he also never married, despite the Sultan's repeated offers to arrange advantageous matches. He never purchased property, never accumulated the visible wealth his position warranted. He lived like a man who expected his current circumstances to end, though no one, observing him, could have said why. The truth was simpler and more complicated than anyone suspected. Skanderbeg had not forgotten who he was. He had merely learned to bury that knowledge so deep that even he could not always find it. In dreams, sometimes, he would hear his mother's voice singing Albanian lullabies, would see his father's face on the ramparts of Kruja. He would wake with the taste of tears and spend the day performing his Ottoman duties with such perfection that no one suspected the rebellion fermenting in his heart. News reached him, occasionally, through the informal networks that connected all displaced peoples. His father had died in 1437, still a vassal of the Sultan, his remaining lands diminished, his spirit broken. His brothers had vanished into the machinery of empire, dead or simply lost, no one could say. His mother had retreated to a convent where she spent her days praying for sons she would never see again. Each piece of news was another coal added to a fire Skanderbeg had learned to keep invisible. In 1443, opportunity finally came disguised as disaster. The Hungarian king, John Hunyadi, launched a crusade against the Ottoman Empire, inflicting a series of devastating defeats that shook the foundations of Ottoman power in Europe. Sultan Murad, facing the most serious military crisis of his reign, mobilized every available force to meet the threat. Skanderbeg was given command of a cavalry force and ordered to join the main army marching to confront Hunyadi. The two armies met near the city of Niš, in what is now Serbia. The battle that followed was a catastrophe for the Ottomans. Hunyadi's heavy cavalry shattered the Turkish center, and for a few hours it seemed the entire Ottoman position in Europe might collapse. In the chaos of retreat, Skanderbeg made his move. The Ottoman secretary was a small man with ink-stained fingers and nervous eyes. He had served the army's administrative corps for 15 years and had never been alone with a commander of Skanderbeg's rank. Now, in a tent at the rear of the retreating army, he found himself facing the Albanian sword. "You will write what I dictate," Skanderbeg said. His voice was calm, almost gentle. "You will use the Sultan's seal, which I know you carry. And then you will leave this tent and tell no one what has happened here." The secretary's hands trembled as he prepared his writing materials. "My lord, this is treason?" Skanderbeg smiled for the first time. "Yes, but not against any lord I chose." "Right." The letter was brief and devastating. It commanded the Ottoman garrison at Kruja to surrender the fortress immediately to the bearer, Skanderbeg, who had been appointed the new governor by Sultan Murad himself. The secretary wrote it, sealed it, and fled into the night, too terrified to speak of what he had witnessed. Skanderbeg rode through the next 3 days with a small group of Albanian cavalry who had served under his command, men he had quietly gathered over years, binding them with hints and half-promises of a day that might come. They rode in Ottoman uniforms, carrying Ottoman documents, passing through Ottoman checkpoints with the confidence of men who belonged exactly where they were. On the evening of November 28, 1443, Skanderbeg presented his forged letter to the garrison commander at Kruja. The commander, a veteran Turk who had held the fortress for a decade, studied the document carefully. The seal was genuine. The signature matched the Sultan's hand, or at least matched it closely enough that questioning it might be more dangerous than accepting it. He surrendered the keys without protest. That night, Skanderbeg climbed to the highest tower of the fortress, where his father had once stood watching Ottoman armies descend like locusts. He looked out over the mountains of Albania, his mountains, the mountains that had raised Castriotis for generations, and raised a flag he had carried hidden in his saddlebag for 20 years. It was red, the color of blood and courage, and in its center was a black double-headed eagle, the ancient symbol of Albanian independence, the same eagle his family had flown before the Ottomans came. Word spread through the mountain villages like wildfire. Skanderbeg, the Sultan's own general, had returned. The son of young Castrioti had come home. Within weeks, Albanian chieftains who had submitted to Ottoman rule for decades began arriving at Kruja. They came with warriors, sometimes dozens, sometimes hundreds, and they came with a hunger that had been building for a generation. At a council held in the Cathedral of Leju, 25 Albanian nobles swore an oath of alliance. They named Skanderbeg their captain general, their leader in the war they all knew was coming. The League of Leju was born, and with it, the Ottoman Empire discovered it had created its own nemesis. Sultan Murad II did not immediately grasp the significance of what had happened in Albania. He was occupied with Hunyadi's crusade, with diplomatic maneuvers, with the thousand concerns that pressed upon a ruler of such vast territories. A single renegade commander, however brilliant, seemed a minor problem, an annoyance to be dealt with once more pressing matters were resolved. This miscalculation would cost the empire dearly. In the spring of 1444, Murad sent an army of 25,000 men to crush the rebellion and recapture Kruj. The commander was Ali Pasha, a veteran who had known Skanderbeg in the imperial service and dismissed him as clever but fundamentally limited, a tactician, not a strategist, unsuited for independent command. Ali Pasha never reached Kruj. The Albanian mountains offered no pitched battles, no open fields where Ottoman numbers and discipline could achieve their usual dominance. Instead, they offered ambush sites where a few hundred men could hold passes against thousands. They offered supply lines that stretched through hostile territory, vulnerable to raids that struck and vanished before response was possible. They offered a population that had spent generations learning to survive by knowing every path, every cave, every place where a small force could hide. Skanderbeg used all of it. His strategy was simple in concept, diabolically complex in execution. He never attacked strength directly. Instead, he targeted Ottoman logistics, supply wagons, forage parties, messenger routes. He forced the enemy to guard everything, which meant they could concentrate nothing. When Ali Pasha divided his forces to protect his lines of communication, Skanderbeg struck the weakened divisions with overwhelming local superiority. When the Ottomans concentrated for safety, he simply waited, watching their supplies dwindle, while his own forces lived off the land they knew intimately. The Battle of Lower Dibra, in June 1444, demonstrated his methods perfectly. Ali Pasha had finally cornered what he believed to be the main Albanian force in a valley, trapping them between his army and a steep mountainside. He prepared for a dawn assault that would end the rebellion in a single stroke. At dawn, the valley was empty. While Ali Pasha slept, Skanderbeg's forces had climbed the impassable mountainside, using paths known only to local shepherds. They emerged behind the Ottoman camp just as the morning prayers were ending, and for the next 3 hours, they turned the Sultan's army into a fleeing mob. Ali Pasha himself barely escaped, leaving behind his war chest, his standards, and his reputation. The victory transformed Skanderbeg from a rebel into a legend. Across Europe, Christian kingdoms that had watched Ottoman expansion with helpless terror suddenly saw hope. The Pope sent congratulations and a modest sum of money. Venice, which had extensive commercial interests in Albania, began quiet negotiations. Even Hunyadi, still fighting his own war against the Ottomans, sent messages of admiration and alliance. But Skanderbeg understood what his admirers did not, that one victory, even a dozen victories, meant nothing against an empire with seemingly limitless reserves of men and material. The Ottomans would return. They would always return in larger numbers, with better commanders, with the full weight of an empire determined to crush the one man who had proven that empire could bleed. He spent the winter fortifying Kruj, stockpiling supplies, training recruits in the guerrilla tactics that would become his signature, and he waited. Murad II arrived personally in 1450, at the head of an army that contemporary sources numbered at 100,000. Even accounting for exaggeration, medieval chroniclers never met a number they couldn't inflate. It was the largest force the Ottomans had ever sent against a single Balkan opponent. The message was clear. Albania would be crushed so thoroughly that no one would dare resist Ottoman power again. The siege of Kruj that followed lasted 5 months and accomplished nothing. Skanderbeg refused to be trapped inside his fortress. While a small garrison held the walls, he operated in the surrounding mountains with his mobile forces, attacking Ottoman supply lines with such frequency that the besiegers began to starve before the besieged. Every foraging party became a potential battle. Every night brought the possibility of raids that left sentries dead and supplies burning. The vast Ottoman army discovered it was being eaten alive by an enemy it couldn't pin down. Murad threw assault after assault against Kruj's walls, and each assault broke against defenders who knew they had nowhere to retreat. Albanian women carried stones and boiling water to the ramparts. Children ran messages through secret passages. The elderly prayed in the same chapel where Skanderbeg had been baptized as an infant, their voices rising with each Ottoman failure. In October, with winter approaching and his army reduced by disease, desertion, and Skanderbeg's constant harassment, Murad lifted the siege. It was the first time in his reign he had personally commanded an unsuccessful campaign. The humiliation haunted him until his death just months later. His son, Mehmed II, would prove an even more formidable opponent. Mehmed was 21 when he became sultan, young and hungry to prove himself greater than his father. Within 3 years, he had accomplished what no Ottoman ruler had achieved: the conquest of Constantinople, ending the Byzantine Empire that had endured for over 1,000 years. The young sultan who walked through the ruins of Hagia Sophia was no longer simply a ruler. He was the conqueror, and he believed no fortress could stand against him. Albania would test that belief to its limits. Between 1450 and 1466, Mehmed sent expedition after expedition against Skanderbeg. The names of the campaigns blur together in the historical record: Polog, Oranik, Ohrid, Mokra, but the pattern remained constant. Ottoman armies would enter the Albanian mountains confident of easy victory. They would find an enemy who refused to fight on their terms, who struck from unexpected directions, who made every mile of advance cost more than it was worth. They would eventually retreat, diminished and demoralized, leaving Skanderbeg still unconquered. The cost was staggering on both sides. Albania was repeatedly ravaged, its villages burned, its crops destroyed, its people driven into ever more remote mountain refuges. Skanderbeg lost battles as well as won them. He was wounded multiple times, captured once and ransomed, betrayed by allies who found Ottoman gold more compelling than Albanian freedom. Yet still he fought. Year after year, campaign after campaign, he remained what he had become on that night in Kruja in 1443, the living symbol that the Ottoman Empire could be defied. No man carries such a burden without cost. By his 50s, Skanderbeg was exhausted in ways that transcended physical fatigue. He had outlived his brothers, his parents, most of the companions who had followed him home from Ottoman service. He had watched Albania bled white by decades of war, had ordered retreats that left villages to Ottoman mercy, had made choices that haunted his increasingly rare hours of sleep. His marriage to Danica, daughter of a noble Albanian family, had produced a son, John, named for Skanderbeg's father. But his duties left little time for the domestic peace other men enjoyed. He was constantly moving, constantly planning, constantly juggling alliances that shifted like mountain mist. Venice, Naples, Hungary, the papacy, all promised support, and all delivered less than they promised, pursuing their own interests, while Albania bled. The betrayals cut deepest. Albanian nobles who had sworn oaths at Liege defected to the Ottomans when the price was right. Moise Golemi, one of his most trusted commanders, switched sides twice, and Skanderbeg, understanding that he could not fight both the Ottomans and his own people, found himself forced to forgive what he could not forget. The politics of survival left no room for the luxury of principled consistency. Yet through it all, he maintained the one thing that mattered most: the ability to make the Ottomans pay for every inch of Albanian soil. His military genius had not dimmed with age. If anything, experience had refined it to something approaching art. He knew his mountains as a poet knows his language, could read terrain the way scholars read texts, anticipated Ottoman movements with an accuracy that seemed almost supernatural to his enemies. In 1464, Pope Pius II attempted to organize a new crusade against the Ottomans, with Skanderbeg designated as a key commander. The Albanian traveled to Italy, met with the Pope and various Christian monarchs, pleaded for the united effort that might finally break Ottoman power. For a moment it seemed possible, an alliance of Venice, Hungary, Burgundy, and Albania, striking simultaneously while the Ottomans were overextended. Then Pius II died, and the crusade died with him. The alliance dissolved into mutual recrimination. Skanderbeg returned to Albania with promises but no armies, facing yet another Ottoman invasion with only the forces he had always commanded, Albanian mountaineers who had never known any leader but him. The campaign of 1466 was particularly brutal. Mehmed II, now at the height of his power after conquering most of the Balkans, sent his Grand Vizier with instructions to finish the Albanian problem permanently. Balaban Pasha, himself an Albanian by birth, converted and raised in Ottoman service much as Skanderbeg had been, led an army that showed no mercy to a land and people he had once called his own. Skanderbeg defeated him anyway. At the Battle of Albulina, He achieved perhaps his most complete victory, routing the Ottoman army so thoroughly that Balaban himself was captured. But it was a triumph that felt hollow. Albania was devastated, its population reduced to a fraction of what it had been before the wars began. The victory had been won, but the country it saved barely existed anymore. The winter of 1466-1467 was the harshest in living memory. Snow fell early and deep, trapping what remained of Albania's population in isolated villages where food was scarce and hope scarcer. Skanderbeg spent the season doing what he had done for 23 years, preparing for the next Ottoman attack, corresponding with potential allies, trying to hold together an alliance that existed more in name than reality. His health, never robust after decades of campaigning, began to fail seriously. Fevers came and went. Wounds that had healed poorly reopened. The vitality that had carried him through impossible odds seemed finally to be exhausting itself. Yet when spring arrived and scouts reported another Ottoman army massing on the border, Skanderbeg rode out to meet it as he always had. The campaign that followed was brief, a series of skirmishes that accomplished little for either side, but it demonstrated that the old lion still had teeth. The Ottomans withdrew rather than risk another major engagement. In the autumn of 1467, Skanderbeg traveled to Lezhë for what would be his final strategic conference. The nobles who gathered there, the survivors of the original league, their sons and successors, saw a man visibly dying. His face was gaunt, his hands trembled, and the famous dark eyes seemed focused on something beyond the walls of the room. He spoke to them of continuity, of the need to maintain the alliance after he was gone. He spoke of his son, Gjon, who was still too young to lead, but who carried the Castrioti blood. He spoke of the mountains themselves, which had sheltered Albanians before the Ottomans came, and would shelter them after the Ottomans were dust. They will return, he said, and everyone knew he meant the Ottomans. They will always return, but remember what we have proven, that they can be defeated. Not once, not twice, but again and again. They are not gods. They are men, and men can be beaten by other men who refuse to surrender. The conference ended without resolution. There was no clear successor, no plan for maintaining resistance, no realistic hope that the alliance would survive its founder. Everyone present understood that Albania's independence was measured not in years, but in the remaining heartbeats of one man. January 1468 brought the fever that would not break. Skanderbeg had contracted malaria. Some said from the swamps near Lezhë, others believed it was simply the accumulated toll of a life spent in camps and campaigns finally claiming its due. He was moved to the fortress of Lezhë, where a small group of nobles and commanders kept vigil. Donica was there, the wife who had shared so little of his time and so much of his burden. His son Gjon, now 13, stood with the bewildered dignity of a boy suddenly facing responsibilities he could not yet comprehend. Priests prayed continuously in an adjoining room, their chants mixing with the wind that howled through the mountain passes. For several days, Skanderbeg drifted between consciousness and delirium. In his fever dreams, he reportedly called out names: his father, his mother, his brothers who had disappeared into Ottoman service. He spoke in Albanian and Turkish, and sometimes in languages no one recognized, the babble of a mind confronting its own dissolution. On January 17, 1468, he woke clear-eyed and asked to be raised so he could see through the window. The mountains were invisible behind clouds of snow, but he stared at where they should be, as if memorizing something essential. "I have held them for 25 years, he said to those gathered around him. "A generation has grown up knowing that resistance is possible. Remember that, when they come again." He died that evening, with his wife holding one hand and his sword lying across his chest. He was 63 years old, had fought over 24 major campaigns against the greatest military power on earth, and had never once been conquered. The news spread through Albania like the tolling of a funeral bell, and then beyond, to Venice, to Rome, to every corner of Europe that had watched Skanderbeg's impossible defiance with wonder and envy. Pope Paul II, receiving the report, reportedly said, "Today, the Christian world has lost one of its greatest defenders." Sultan Mehmed II, informed of his enemy's death, is said to have responded differently. "Asia and Europe are mine at last," he declared. Woe to Christendom. It has lost its sword and shield. The Ottoman army returned in 1478. 10 years after Skanderbeg's death, Kruja fell after a brutal siege. The last Albanian nobles surrendered or fled into exile, taking Skanderbeg's son with them to Italy. Within a few years, the country that had defied an empire for a quarter century was absorbed into Ottoman administration as thoroughly as if the rebellion had never occurred, or so it appeared. The Ottomans found they had conquered a land, but not a people. Albanian identity, forged in the crucible of Skanderbeg's wars, proved impossible to eradicate. Families passed down stories of the resistance from generation to generation. The double-headed eagle appeared in hidden places, scratched into stones, woven into patterns that foreigners could not read, preserved in the collective memory that empires cannot touch. For 400 years, Albania remained under Ottoman rule. And for 400 years, Albanians remembered the man who had proven that rule could be defied. When independence finally came in 1912, the flag that rose over Tirana bore the same double-headed eagle Skanderbeg had raised over Kruja in 1443. His legacy extended far beyond Albania's borders. Military historians studied his campaigns for centuries, finding in them principles of asymmetric warfare that would be rediscovered and renamed in countless later conflicts. The Ottoman Empire itself never forgot him. Documents from the imperial archives continued to reference the Albanian problem generations after his death, treating it as a cautionary tale about the limits of even overwhelming power. But perhaps his greatest legacy was simpler than strategy or symbol. He proved that one man, choosing courage when prudence counseled submission, could change the course of history. He had every reason to remain what the Ottoman system had made him, a brilliant commander with a comfortable life, climbing the imperial hierarchy while his homeland languished under foreign rule. Instead, he remembered who he was. He went home, and he fought. The mountains still stand where they stood in his day, weathered but enduring. The fortress of Kruja still commands its valley, rebuilt and preserved as a monument to national memory. And on winter nights, when the wind howls through the passes, elderly Albanians still tell their grandchildren stories of Skanderbeg, the boy who was stolen, the man who returned, the eagle who refused to fall while he had strength to fly. His body rested in a church in Lazio until Ottoman forces exhumed it, supposedly to make amulets from his bones, believing that the courage that had defied them for so long must have had some magical source. They were wrong, of course. The source was entirely human, the irreducible determination of a man who decided that some things are worth fighting for, even when the fight seems impossible. 25 years. Against the largest empire on earth, with resources that would barely register as a rounding error in Ottoman logistics. He lost eventually. Everyone does in the end. But he lost on his terms, in his mountains, with his sword in his hand and his flag still flying. And that perhaps is the only victory that truly matters. Gjorge Kastrioti Skanderbeg, the Dragon of Albania, the man the Ottoman Empire could not defeat.